have like a water jug that's copper, and they can have their water in there and then pour it out. And that way you don't end up with saliva or anything like that inside that's going to cause copper to oxidize and then need more cleaning. So if you take your water, whether you are a tap water drinker or a filtered water drinker, you can put it in more of a copper container, let it sit so that it gets copperized, so it absorbs some of the qualities of the copper, we would say in Ayurveda. And then you can just pour from that into a regular drinking glass, because regular drinking glasses you can throw in the dishwasher, easy to clean. But if you have a copper cup and you keep touching your lips to it, then eventually the saliva, the bacteria, your biome becomes its biome, but then all of a sudden it needs a lot more cleaning. So yeah,
interesting.
Instead.
I just recently bought one when I was in Bali, but it's in storage in Australia. But I definitely noticed the difference when I was drinking out of the copper instead of having like the plastic ones or whatever, even just glass. It did have more of a kind of a fresh kind of taste, and it tasted a little bit of a mineral. I don't know if it was just in my head, but and because Bali is very hot, so maybe it just seemed that it was like really fresh and cold when it was in the copper pot.
And it's so interesting, this idea of cool and warm as potency or as energy, because you can have a substance that is hot in temperature and yet has a cooling effect on the body. A good example of that would be like mint tea, right? So mint is cooling. Once it's inside and processed by the body, it cools the body down. However, our most common way of consuming it is in the form of a hot tea. So with copper, what copper does is it has the effect of cooling us internally. So in a hot place like Bali, it makes so much sense. But I think of right now, like yesterday, it snowed where I am, not copper season, right? So there's all sorts of like different, maybe someone is perimenopausal and having a lot of internal heat. And so then maybe copper makes sense for them regardless of the season, but based on their individual context. So, yeah.
I already feel like we started the podcast, so I'm going to roll into it, Mona. What do you describe to people, like what you do? Because your niche is very creative in the different modalities that you kind of collectively bring together. I want to talk about the books that you have, particularly the one with Ayurveda and grief. I just found that really fascinating. Again, to bring those two modalities together. I don't think I've ever seen anyone actually bring it into a journal, which I think is amazing. So how do you describe what you do in a sentence? And we'll break it down.
Yeah, well, the initial thing I tend to tell people is I have the strangest job in the whole world. The work I do is to help people remember things they already know. So a lot of my work is one of helping people remember, because we do know ourselves and we know what we need, and we know us better than anyone else will ever know us. And we forget, we get overwhelmed, we get distracted. And so my primary job is to help people remember who they are so that they can identify what they need for their own health and well-being. And then the tools I use for that is I use an Indian medicine known as Ayurveda. So I'm a doctor of Ayurvedic medicine. I use the amazing tools of yoga. So similar yet distinct toolkit from Ayurveda. And a lot of folks are a lot more familiar with yoga and its practices. And I've also studied Vedic astrology, and my intention for studying the astrology was interesting. It was before I completed my Ayurveda doctor program, but I realized and had heard from others that there are all sorts of different challenges, whether it's a physical health, a mental health, and emotional health challenges that can arise based on what's happening in your chart and what is getting activated at this current time. And there was a thing that happened for me, a few things actually that happened for me, that understanding my chart, all of a sudden I was like, oh, that's why that's happening. Or conversely, oh, that's why I can't seem to get this to happen right now. And so I feel like those three tools together, and in the Vedic, so the traditional Vedic science toolkit, there's even more tools, but I'm only one person. I can only do so many things. And what the joke between myself and some of my good friends is, I took these things that each of them takes a lifetime to learn, and I'm trying to learn them all in one lifetime. So as a lifetime of study and practice and exploration, Ayurveda the same, and astrology the same. So I use primarily Ayurveda and yoga, and when necessary, if necessary, then I can draw the astrology in as well. Sometimes it helps to explain things. And again, every time I do a chart reading, people are like, huh, I kind of knew that, but now I feel like it's okay that I'm like this. And with the Ayurveda and the yoga, oh, I kind of knew that about myself, but now I feel like I feel more okay with who I am, given the lens that this has reflected for me. So I help people remember.
Yeah, it's a huge kind of overview. To break it down, so basically Ayurveda is the sister science of yoga. Can you explain a little bit what, if no one has actually heard of Ayurveda, can you explain, like, I know it's a lot to explain, but like in simple terms, to break it down to someone who's not heard of it, what is it and why does it help? And why do we not practice it so much with yoga as well? I'm going to throw that in there for you.
I love it. So the story I tend to tell my students is that if yoga and Ayurveda were each on their own boat, and they're both on the shores of India, back in the late 1800s, both these boats left the shores, and the Ayurveda boat somehow got distracted and took a detour. So here in the West, like where I am in the Americas, right? I'm Canadian. So in North America, the yoga boat landed first. And based on the context in which it was taught to be, or it was interpreted, I think, to be this one thing. And it's curious because I hear a lot of people say, you know, yoga and Ayurveda are sister sciences. And I actually slightly disagree a little bit. So knowing what I know, I have a different language that I use. I refer to them as allied sciences. Because when we say sister sciences, people think that they're more similar than they are. And so if we look foundationally at the goals of these two practices, so what is the goal of yoga? The goal of yoga is enlightenment. It's moksha, right? It is being able to transcend the suffering that we create for ourselves based on our illusory relationship with what we think is reality, but is it reality? Whereas Ayurveda's goal is very different: to maintain the health of the healthy person and to reclaim health where health might be able to be reclaimed. Those are two very different goals, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can be healthy and go for enlightenment. I would actually argue they are supportive. However, they are not the same. And that's why when you hear people talk about like the yogic diet, and then they start learning about the Ayurvedic way of working with nutrition, people get a little wobbly and they go, wait, but yoga. And I'm like, yeah, and yoga is amazing and different in its goals, in its purpose from Ayurveda. And so I think these allied sciences are definitely super complementary. My teacher, Dr. Anusha, would argue that actually Ayurveda is step one, yoga is step two. And so and so then what is Ayurveda if it's step one to yoga, for all the yogis listening? So, right? So then, oh my gosh, well then what is this? Did I skip? That's how I felt. I was like, did I skip a step? I think I skipped a step. And then I was like, of course I skipped a step. That's my nature. And so what is Ayurveda? Ayurveda is a medical science originating in India a long, long time ago. There's lots of I'll say, controversy about how long. Some say 5,000, some say 10,000. And my favorite is since the dawn of mankind existing in community, which I love it because it's very dramatic. And there's a little part of me that's like into a little bit of drama here and there. So let's just say long time, therefore time tested. But what is it? So Ayurveda uses an understanding of nature, as in we are a strand in the tapestry of nature, and the whole universe, hello astrology, the whole universe we live in is also part of nature. And what Ayurveda does is it helps us to build strength and stability and health and resilience by understanding our nature and its relationship with the bigger nature, the macro and the micro, our environment. So in a nutshell, Ayurveda is about rhythmic living. It's about learning our rhythm. Yeah, I know. I worked on that elevator speech for a long time.
It really fits into the seasons, and it makes more sense, right? Because you have Pitta, Kapha, thank you, the three constitutions. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
It's in Ayurveda, what the Ayurvedic originators or what the sages shared with us is that everything in nature has a rhythm. So we have an individual rhythm, and then our environment, and different environments have different rhythms. So some places like India have 6 seasons. Where I live in Ontario, Canada, we have 4 seasons. I had a client who lived in Thailand who had 2 seasons. A client who lives in Texas who swears they only have 1 season. Hot, hot, and still hot. So I do think
as well.
Yeah, a few more seasons than that, but she was very Pitta, very fire oriented. And so her observation was, it's always hot here. I'm always hot when I'm in Texas. So given that each environment has its rhythm, what the doshas are, in my perspective, they are organizing energies. And so the word dosha confuses people because we use one Sanskrit word to mean different things, because Sanskrit is textual language. So depending on the context, one word could mean something very different. So dosha at a foundational level refers to the subtle energies that help to organize everything so that we live in a functional world, so that we have functional bodies. And so doshas are, I like to call them functional units, right? They help to make sure that we have certain functions that are well established and that work in a way that we can expect so that we can work towards health and well-being. Within that, so everyone has all the energies. Everyone has all 5 elements. The doshas help to regulate the way the elements are organized in our body minds. And so everyone has all 3 of this vata, pitta, and kapha energy. Now, the way it tends to be more modern used, so in a modern context, when they're talking about dosha, they tend to be referring to what is an individual's nature, as in how much of each of the 5 elements, space, air, fire, water, and earth, how much of the 5 elements do I have, and do I have one that's stronger or louder or predominant? So vata dosha governs the functions of air and space in the body mind. And so if somebody has a lot more air and space in their physical body and in their mind, they're going to behave a little differently and maybe have a very different physical look and feel, a different structure than someone who's more pitta. And pitta energy governs the fire element and the water element. So already we have like air and space, and then we have fire and water. Could it be more different? And so who's more pitta will have a little bit more of this expression of fire and warmth and heat, whereas someone who's a little more vata will tend to be lighter and drier and have, again, the air element's primary quality is mobility. So they will tend to be more restless and want to be on the move. I was at the gym the other day and there was someone who joined us, and not even for 2 seconds was she able to stand still and just like lift the kettlebell. She was like here and there and this kettlebell and that kettlebell and my arm here and bounce and spring. And I was like, ooh, so much vata, like that mobile air moving through space energy. Whereas someone else at the gym, he was like, I am doing the thing. And it was just like sharp, penetrating, focused heat energy. And of course, he was the one peeling off the layers, right? All that heat. And then our third dosha energy is kapha, and kapha energy governs water and earth. So again, super different. We're going to notice more structure, denser structure, heavier structure. We're going to notice more stability. Maybe they're going to move, walk, talk, and think a little more slowly because wind moves so fast, fire is so sharp, but water and earth, this is a little bit slower, denser, calmer energy. And so these doshas, the common thing is like the quiz, you know, sort of like Cosmopolitan magazine quizzes.
Yes.
Go through and you're like, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And in my experience, a little more nuanced than that, but also very interesting. And I find that doshas are really interesting, but you have to be willing to invest quite a bit of time and energy into understanding the nuances in order for that to be a useful model or a useful map to use in Ayurveda. And I think for some people, it's interesting. And then they get really overwhelmed because they don't like, which one am I? And then they're like, well, if I don't know who I am, then obviously I can't work with this. And they tap out. So interestingly, Ayurveda has provided us with other maps that you can use, whether you figured out the dosha piece or not. There are still lots of beautiful, wonderful practices to help you maintain the health you have and to keep building your resilience, your stability, which will lead to more of a sense of inner calm and peace. And then we're so ready for yoga.
Mm-hmm.
So ready for yoga if we have that inner stability. Although I did it the other way. I did yoga first, and it was through yoga that I was introduced to Ayurveda. So
I think that is like the norm with a lot of people. They find yoga first, and yoga is kind of like the doorway to open your mind up to different avenues and be more mindful of your body in how you move. So how does Vedic astrology fit into the component of doshas, and how do you teach someone about Vedic astrology? Do you do the charts, or do you do courses, or how do you implement?
yeah, so I've done both. I've run as part of my advanced yoga teacher training and introduction to astrology, just like an introduction to Ayurveda. So I'm a big fan of being able to introduce the allied sciences in any modality. So even when I teach Ayurveda, I introduce astrology and I introduce yoga. And then when I teach, right? Because the idea, it's to help us recognize just how big these Vedic teachings are, and that there's more than one perspective. So there's more than one angle that we could be looking at things at, because sometimes the angle we're at, just based on where we are, isn't helping.
Yeah.
And so we can bring like all the tools we have of the thing, and it's like, this isn't helping. I need another perspective. And so I find learning the different sciences is a nice way, although slowly and a little bit at a time, to keep broadening that perspective so that we have more opportunity, you know, more things that we could consider. And usually with folks, I feel like the best thing to do for them to start learning about the astrology is to have a natal chart reading. And so to actually get their birth chart read, and then I can introduce them to what I call the four main layers of your birth chart. And so that's, you have to understand and get to know a little bit the different houses and what they represent. And then on top of that, we layer the signs and what the signs tell us. And then on top of
the Western astrology signs?
Yeah. So Vedic astrology is a little bit different than Western astrology, because there's two main sort of, if we were to take astrology as like the head of the tree, And then I'm a flow chart person, so I think in flow charts.
Yeah.
So if we were to, then the next sort of division would be what we call sidereal astrology, which means based on where are the stars in the sky. And then we have tropical astrology, which is the spring equinox marks 0 degrees of Aries. So the two, it's interesting. I believe that a couple thousand years ago, they would have been saying the same thing and reading the sky the same way. But as time has passed, there's like a greater and greater spacing between how they read the sky, which is so fascinating. Almost one whole sign difference. So in Vedic astrology, which is sidereal, they read the stars. I'm a Cancer rising. In tropical or Western astrology, when I had my Western herbalism teacher read my chart, she was like, "You are a Leo rising," and I was like, "Amazing! That's totally different. It's literally the moon and the sun, right? So completely different, and both of them accurate to a degree. So I don't think anyone was wrong. Again, different perspective. So the signs are the same signs in all the systems as far as I can tell. And I only know like Western and Vedic astrology, and I mostly know Vedic astrology. But that's because the signs are basically the star constellations around us. And so they're the same for everyone. Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, etc. So then we introduce that because that also gives us another layer of information about the person. Then the planets. We introduce the planets because the planets are where the karmas are, right? So Vedic astrology is very much about the science of karma, as in the science of action and effect. Action and effect. And so
reincarnation also interpreted in this in Vedic astrology?
So whether people believe in reincarnation or not is one thing. And Vedic astrology does believe in reincarnation. And so there are parts of a chart that can indicate something coming in from a previous experience or incarnation that is coming to fruition in this lifetime. And I've seen that. I've seen some interesting things with regards to that in reading other people's charts.
I'm sure you have.
I've seen some things that I'm like, that's so cool. My mind is blown. And I've seen other things where I'm like, my mind is blown, but more in a heartbreaking way. And I'm only a baby astrologer. So I've only been reading charts for, I don't know, I think I'm on my like 4th or 5th year. I've read a couple hundred charts, but I'm only in my 4th or 5th year. So I consider myself a baby everything until I hit about the 15, 20 year mark. And then I'm like, okay, now I'm feeling a little more confident. And the fourth thing I teach people about is what we call the Mahadasha, or the planetary periods. So in Vedic astrology, part of how charts are read, you can do what's active in the chart based on current transit, so what's happening in the sky right now. But there's also what I think of as the wheel of planetary periods. And so there's this part of a chart, the way they do it in Vedic astrology, I think is really powerful, where it lets us know based on what's active in your chart, what sort of chapter of your life you're in right now. And it's so interesting and fascinating. And I think that's the part where people are like, oh, that's why this is happening now, or, oh, that explains why that happened then. So it's nothing people don't know in a way, but now they have a language and a framework within which to understand and describe it, or even just understand it for themselves. I'm in this chapter of my life right now. I was in that chapter then. That's why things have changed. So yeah, it's interesting, and it can help people.
You have a very unique approach, and we've mentioned and gone through a little bit of what you actually do and elaborate a little bit on reading some of your clients' charts. Can you elaborate though a little bit more how you actually tailor both of those methods, the Ayurveda and the Vedic astrology, into like a client session? Because hearing what you're talking about, it's super interesting. And I wanted to ask about past karma. And obviously, also when you talk about the doshas and the kapha, the vata, the pitta, like how does it's a lot of information, right? Because you're looking, like, as you said, it's a lot to study, it's a lot of information. So how do you really bring it to basics for people, so when they wake up in the morning, just say, because I'm doing a lot with people and students that are actually in burnout, and I would assume if you read someone's chart of people who are in burnout, they're going to be a little bit more, I guess, fire and air energy. I don't know if you've come across this or not, and what kind of information and practices would you give someone who is experiencing burnout?
Yeah, it's a very really common right now, isn't it? That sense of exhaustion, depletion, and burnout. So when I do a natal chart, what it gives me a sense of is somebody's baseline constitution or their baseline doshic composition. But then there's all the layers of life that go on top of that, which is why it can be hard to know what is my constitution. Because if we're looking through layers of seasons and stress and illness and disease and grief and joy and ecstasy, and then all this other stuff of life on top, when you look down through the hand sandwich, it's like, I don't know what's going on. I'm seeing all the things, and I don't know if that's who I am. So typically, when I work with clients, they come in through one of two doorways. The first doorway would be to say, I'm not feeling well. I'd like an Ayurvedic consultation. Can we do that? And the answer is yes, because we're here to, as you know, like, we're here to help, right? That's literally what we do. And so in that case, we'll tend to have a very practical conversation about, where are you at? What are you noticing? What's causing the suffering? I might not use that language, but that's what we're getting at. What is causing the suffering for you right now? And then in Ayurveda is actually so logical. It's incredible. We will then start to look back. When did this start? Have you had it before? Is there a history in the family? You know, on and on and on. And from that, I'll be able to, in my mind, so where I come in is not only being able to listen to someone tell their story, which is inherently therapeutic if it's in a safe environment. So I get to listen to someone's story, but at the same time, I'm putting together in my mind the trajectory of what has happened and where did things hiccup? Where did we end up with hiccups in the giddy up that veered the course of the ship? And now all of a sudden that we're this far off course, we're very uncomfortable. And this is not working for me, whether it's perimenopause or andropause, whether it's I got COVID and I'm just not healing up for that, whether it's, you know, insert XYZ here, all the things. And so then what we'll do is we'll have a part of the conversation that'll be a little bit like, how much time do you have to do things? Because Ayurveda demands practice. So you can't just know about Ayurveda. You need to actually engage.
Change.
Right? Like, so it could be nutritional changes. It could be practice changes. It could be lifestyle changes. So then I need to assess, what are we willing to do? Because some people are like closing doors. This, don't even talk to me about yeah. I had one person come in. Yeah, I had a person come in one time and be like, and don't you dare try to change my diet. And I was like, oh, we just met. I haven't even had the part of the conversation where I say, you know, are you familiar with Ayurveda? Can I answer any? Like, didn't even go there. It was just like, I am not doing this. And so I was like, great. So maybe we'll work with breath. Maybe we'll work with yoga practices. Maybe we'll work with lifestyle components because the dietary piece is off the table. Whereas usually Ayurveda does both, right? Where our foundational principles are being able to help people work with nutrition and lifestyle practices in order to create a stable baseline. And then from there, as we need to, we can do more things. We could add herbal or herbo mineral medicines. We, you know, there's all sorts of other things. So if people come to me through the Ayurveda door, usually by the time they leave, they will get 3 to 5 ideas of practices that they will go and and explore and see how that fits in their life. And if it helps to move the needle far enough for them to come back to a state of balance. And some, depending how far off course we are, we might need multiple sessions, and each one we tweak, and we know we have to do this first, and then we do this second, and then we do this third. So it might be a tiered approach. Some people will take the recommendations and just go run with it for a year and then come back a year later and be like, here's where I'm at, let's do more things. Or I'm good, I'm where I need to be, thanks, bye, right? Like everybody's very different. Whereas if somebody comes for an astrology reading, usually that ends up stemming more from spiritual, existential kind of stuff, or pure curiosity. They're like, I think I need my chart read because I'm just curious.
Yeah.
And so I find people are coming in through the different doors often with different intentions. And if I need to, I might say to somebody, so say I work with somebody in the Ayurveda yoga realm for a little while, and I feel like there's something else going on, but we're not seeming to be able to like put a finger on it or identify it, then I might suggest, at this point, I think a chart reading would make sense. And I think it might give us some insight that we're not getting through the means of conversational assessment. So we might need to go look at something else in order to see what's happening. And sometimes people will get their chart read. This happened to me about 6 months ago. Someone got their chart read, and as I was talking, she goes, oh, is that why I have health issue XYZPQRS? And I was like, yes, that would be exactly why. And then she said, so what do I do? And I was like, now we have to have an Ayurveda conversation, because me reading your chart doesn't tell me what your current diet and daily routine is.
So what do you see when you read the chart? What are the main principles that you look for, that you pick up? Are you focused on health, or does the karma and the reincarnation, and like, what do you actually see when you read someone's Vedic chart? Are there different layers of how deep we can get into the chart?
There's huge amounts of layers. And like I said, I'm just a baby astrologer. So I needed a remedy for a really bad configuration in my chart that was causing like a ton of suffering. And so I went and saw my astrologer, who referred me to another astrologer who gave me a remedy. So, and in working with the remedy for the past 4 years, that whole area of my life has just like smoothed out, leveled out. And it was so interesting because I could feel the practice starting to like smooth out the rough edges of my mind. So where I had sharp, like bristly areas in my mind, and I would get all like and bent out of shape and contorted, and hence all the suffering. Now when I work with that, I'm like, wow, look at you. Minds are totally different now. What are you doing inside my body? So it's really fascinating because every chart is so unbelievably unique. And what pops out kind of depends. I usually start a chart reading very much the same way. I'm very methodical. So before yoga and Ayurveda and astrology, I actually went to school for business administration with a focus in computer information systems. So I knew how to like,
very logical.
Right, program. Well, and that's why I had to do computers, because I was very intuitive, but I had to learn to bring logic into the mix so that I could have both of the superpowers, right? And so now when I approach a chart, we start out very methodical, but as the person whose chart I'm reading and I start to talk, then it kind of picks up and takes its own pathway, where I might have had one idea, but then based on something they say, I'm like, oh, that's over here in the chart. Let's go to here and talk about this and see how this ties into you now. And so it's a very dynamic process, although it's also very logical. If you don't know your houses, your signs, your planets, your yogas, like the conjunctions and the planetary periods, you can't read a chart at all. So it's amazing how chart reading is very much this blend of like flow and logic at the same time. And so sometimes it is a past life karma thing that comes up. And sometimes it's very much like, this is why right now, the main energies you're feeling are XYZ. And they're like, oh my gosh, I'm like neck deep in it. And I'm like, yeah, and here's where it is in your chart. And here's where it is in the planetary period. This is the chapter of your life you're in now. So here's what we could suggest to help you work your way through that. Right. And it might be an Ayurveda practice. It might be a yoga practice. It might be something else. So yeah, it's really fascinating. And just like an Ayurvedic consultation, I could see 3 people who on paper have the same diagnosis. They're going to leave with very different sets of recommendations because they're different people and they have different needs. And so it's very much, all of what I do very much caters to the individual.
That's what I love about Ayurveda. It really takes on the individual as a whole. You've written 3 books, Mona. You have them on your website. Can you describe and why did you write these 3 books? And I want to talk a little bit about, as you said, you do the Ayurveda in grief. Like, what gave you the inspiration to actually write that book and have it as a journal? Because it is super interesting.
Yeah. So I woke up on January 1st, 2018, and I was like, I'm writing a book this year. I could just like feel it in my bones. I was like, it's a book year. And then I was like, what should I write about? I've got all these things. What on earth do I write about? So I gathered like my closest people and we all sat down together with our friend Susan, who's like a life coach. And I was like, Susan, help us carve a path. Like, let's draw a map of what to do. And so everyone agreed I should write about Ayurvedic yoga because there at the time, especially, there were not a lot of resources. I think there were 3 books on Ayurvedic yoga. And as I was trying to educate myself and then teach Ayurvedic yoga and educate my teacher trainees and students about how to blend Ayurveda and yoga so that we're not diluting anything, we're not making it less Ayurveda or less yoga, like how do we really integrate these things? I had been putting so much, like that was so much what I was in. Everyone was like, that's what you have to write about. And I was like, great. And so I'm going to write a book on Ayurvedic yoga, which I did. But as we were leaving, one of my friends kind of grabs me and goes, I want to read the other book. And I looked at her and I said, but I'm writing a book on Ayurvedic yoga. What are you talking about? She goes, yeah, but as you go to write about Ayurvedic yoga, she's like, there's all these things you're going to want to tell us, but they won't fit in the Ayurvedic yoga book. She goes, but there'll be another book and I want to read that other book. And I was like, dude, no, I'm not committing to that because that is so much like, no. And I'm like, no, like it just did that. And then as I was like in the process of sorting out the first book, I woke up and I remember because we were in Belize, we were on San Pedro Island, and I woke up and I remembered looking out the window and seeing the ocean, and the table of contents for the second book was in my head. So I got up and wrote it all out. And then she was right. As I'd be teaching about this, I'd be like, oh, I want to tell them about this. And I'd be like, that's right, it's in the other book. So I'd write it. But then, so I ended up writing 2 books at once. So the Ayurvedic yoga and Ayurveda's 3 pillars of health. And for anyone who's really new to Ayurveda and they're like, I don't know if I'm into this, aren't I? That's what the 3 pillars of health book is. You don't need to know your dosha. You don't need to have anything coming in, but it will give you some really practical ideas around the maintenance of health from the Ayurvedic perspective, which is super cool. So
can you say a couple of them that's in the book when you say some practical?
Yeah. So we talk about the 3 pillars, which are nourishment and sleep and energy management, right? So you were talking about burnout, students who have burnout.
That sounds exactly what people in burnout need.
Yeah. And so there's so many recommendations, and some of them are very simple. Things like starting the day by rehydrating yourself with a cup of room temperature warm water. I'm a big fan of tongue scraping your tongue to get some of the gunk off, but also to re-enliven the sense of taste, which can bring about a sense of joy and satisfaction in one's life. From a sleep perspective, Ayurvedis, we're routine people, go to bed on time, get up on time, and make sure between those two times, the hours of sleep actually matches your need for sleep. So I had a client once, she sent me this email. She'd been a student of mine for ages. And she said, Mona, I'm exhausted. I need your help. And I was like, great, boom. We hop on a call. And I said, okay, what time are you going to bed? And she was like, midnight. And I said, what time are you getting up in the morning? She said, 5 a.m. And I said, how many hours of sleep do you need? And she said, 8. And I said, we have a math problem, right? All it is a math problem. I said, how do we get you more sleep? And she was like, oh, she's like, that actually makes sense. And all of her symptoms were sleep deprivation symptoms: foggy brain, achy body, slow, lack of energy tanking around 2 to 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And it's like, okay, so get more sleep. And then she emailed me a week later. She's like, I feel a ton better. And I'm like, amazing. Right. Again, Ayurveda can be super logical. And I think where people are exhausted and depleted, it really is about cultivating rest, right? Like rest, because when we rest is also when we digest our emotional load. It's when our body detoxifies. It's when our body rebuilds the tissues. So a lack of rest or poor rest due to stress really impacts our ability to like show up as the person that we hope and inspire to be over the course of whatever days, weeks, months. And this actually leads very well into the Grief and Ayurveda workbook conversation, which is, for me, as just a human being living a human life, right? Married and job and all the things. I went through a period of really intense grief for a time, and it was really hard. And I ended up having to take a break from teaching, and I went into psychotherapy so that I could get help with working with my emotions, because I was in a depression and all these sorts of things. And right before the pandemic started, I was asked by my teacher if I would write an article for the Ayurvedic Journal of Health. And I said to her, I said, I don't want to write a case study. I said, can I write about grief? Because grief is just sort of this like passenger on the boat of my life that's just like part of my life. And I have different times when I have more grief, so I'm closer to that passenger, and I have other times where grief is more like on the other end of the ship from me. But there, like, grief is kind of always there for all of us because of the state of impermanence of the realm that we live in, right? We live in the Mrityu Loka, according to the Vedic teachings, and Mrityu Loka is the realm where everything dies. And so as such, we will always have grief as a passenger on our boat. Whether we're conscious of it or not is different. Whether we want to interact with it or not is different. But as I was studying for my Ayurveda doctor program, I noticed that one of the causative factors for so many illnesses was grief, 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 grief. And then I was like, there you are again, grief, you're back on my boat. Like you slid closer to me. What are we doing? So I started to look into where grief showed up from an Ayurvedic perspective. And I wrote this paper and submitted it to the journal. And a friend of mine read it, and she was like, it would be really cool if you turn this into a workbook, because part of what I was saying was we could use Ayurveda's 3 pillars of health as a way of supporting ourselves in times of grief to reduce the likelihood of the grief becoming a problem. So emotions aren't inherently problematic, but when we get stuck in something, the stuckness creates more suffering. The suffering creates more load. The body has to balance the load. Everything's sort of like, blah, 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 right? We snowball into these wild and weird directions. And so I thought, that's a really cool idea. I would love for this to become practical in some way. And so I worked with a designer to take the original paper and kind of grow it out and build it out. And I'm actually doing a revision right now. I'm doing a version 2 because I'm currently taking an end-of-life care program so that I can better support my own family and my clients and students when they have end-of-life concerns that arise. I wanted to be able to speak to it more compassionately and eloquently and practically. I'm a very utilitarian kind of human. So if it's not practical, I get bored very quickly with it. But I'm revising it because I want to build out the section on grief, and I want to build out the section on some of the things we can do to help us digest our grief, process and work with our grief. So I'm in the process of doing a 2.0 revision on the Grief and Ayurveda workbook, because I think everyone experiences grief. Not everybody comes from an origin where they're allowed or encouraged to work with their emotions in skillful and useful ways. And so if this can help people to kind of, and again, it's not a therapy booklet by any means, but it allows some journaling and some self-reflection. It encourages some different self-care action steps. And it's one of those things that once you have it, you can keep coming back and exploring all the different components that resonate with you for how to support your digestion so you can digest the grief, how to support your sleep so that you can actually rest from the emotional load, how you can work with your daily routine in order to try to maintain the energy you have while you're carrying this extra load of grief. Grief is heavy. I say, and this is a piece I'm adding into the workbook, the idea I have, or the image I have about grief is, it's like if all your emotions were songs in a playlist, and somebody has that playlist on shuffle in random lengths and random volumes. So when you're grieving, 1 second you're okay, you feel like yourself. The next second you're so sad. The next second you're relieved. The next second you're so angry. The next song. And so it's basically just like the shuffled playlist of emotions. I believe grief includes all the emotions possible. And then how you feel about how you feel. Oh, I'm relieved they're not suffering. Oh my God, am I a bad person because I'm not sad that they're dead in this moment? We're so incredible, right? And our capacity to see and to explore and to think is bar none. That's why they're trying to base AI on how a human brain works. But wow, sometimes it really serves us, and sometimes it can just make the load even heavier. So trying to help people help themselves or help each other. Maybe I have a few people who got the grief workbook because they were supporting someone else who was grieving, and they were able to offer suggestions and say, hey, have you thought about, right? So for folks who are grieving and their helpers. Yeah.
I think it's amazing. And I think it's something that as humans, we all have this emotion, whether or not, as you said, it's through someone actually dying, or whether or not it's a feeling or breaking up with someone. I mean, we all experience grief. We are human. But I think it's tremendous how you're putting it into a workbook, how you break it down, digest it. And you can also get it as a PDF on your website as well. So I think it's really, really cool that you're combining all of these different modalities together, because it's not just the mind and the body, it's the actual health, and it's the psychology as well. Because I think a lot of people don't realize the little habits that they do day to day. And that's why I love Ayurveda, because it really puts you in the process of when you wake up in the morning, as you said, of scraping your tongue, even though everyone is very individual and has an individual practice. I know that there's just certain things, like you were talking about before when we started the podcast about the copper, because I bought the copper water bottle and you told me don't drink it from there. So are there any tips that you can give for simple Ayurveda practices, particularly when people wake up in the morning? Because the first thing they tend to go for is their phone or for coffee. How do you get people out of just those little habits to be more mindful and more present? Because I believe when you start your day more mindful, more present, more grounded, you begin with more gratitude. And I just feel like your whole day can be a completely different trajectory than waking up grumpy, look at your phone, reading something that aggravates you, and then brushing your teeth mad, and then your whole day's ruined. So what are some very dramatic, but what are some practical tips with Ayurveda that you can give someone when they wake up in the morning?
I love how you said that, because it's so true how the first few moments can set the tone for the entire day. If you get up, move too fast, and stub your toe, then you're grumpy all day, or if you drop something and make a mess, then you're grumpy for the next couple of hours. So I love that. I find upon waking, it can be really nice for folks to take a few breaths. Don't have to move right away. Take a few breaths. Bring some of that prana, that enlivening energy into the body. I find I like to sit up in bed and I like to put my feet on the floor and feel the full circumference of my heel, the big toe ball mound, the big toe, baby toe ball mound, baby toe, and all the feet, like all the little toes on the floor, however many toes we have. I like to feel my feet on the ground. I like to use the restroom because hopefully if we've been sleeping and detoxifying, then we actually have things that need to move out. That can be great. I love to rinse my eyes with some cool water so I see clearly. I like to scrape my tongue so I taste clearly and brush my teeth. That's a big part. I'm a big fan of morning movement. And so whether it's going for a walk, doing some yoga asana, some gentle stretching, heck, you could turn on, if you're a music person and a dancer, turn on a song you like and get a little boogie on. Even if it's while you're brushing your teeth, there's no reason why you can't brush your teeth and have a little groove on. So something to get the body moving because we've been still for so long. So I tend to prioritize breath and then grounding and then the elimination of waste and then the movement of my body are sort of how I like to start the day. And
I love
yeah, and they're all
it's
kind of
simple and doable.
yeah. And it doesn't have to be like 10 hours of all of it. You know, all of these things can be 30 seconds, a minute, 30 seconds, a minute. Although movement, where people can move their bodies a little bit more, however much you need. If it's 5 minutes, great. If you have 20 or 30 minutes, also great. I feel like that's a really nice way to get the system going so that we can move into our day, as you were describing, in this grounded and open-hearted and settled kind of way.
And to flip that on the other side, you were talking about sleep. And when we sleep, like we turn off the Wi-Fi in the house because we're very aware and sensitive to that, but also getting to bed at a certain time. And I'm just curious, like, obviously with the different doshas, do people need to go to bed at a different time, or is there like a generic time that people should go to sleep so that they are completely restored and refreshed in the morning?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a few different, again, angles or ways we could approach it. One way would be to remember that Ayurveda is like the original circadian medicine. We were always getting up just before the sun was rising and then going to bed around when the sun went down. So if that works for you as a pattern, then you could absolutely follow the rhythm of the sun. And that means that there will be a time of year where you get way more sleep and there will be a time of year where you get less sleep. So that also depends on if that component of it works for you. The other way people will do it is they will become sort of a little bit more fixed. I go to bed at, I'm asleep by, I wake up at, and I'm out of bed by. And for some people that works great, especially if you know, say, I know I'm optimal with 8 to 8.5 hours sleep. I am functional on 7 hours sleep, and I am not fit for public consumption with anything less than 6 hours sleep. Like, do not answer a phone. Do not reply to an email. You are not fit for public consumption at this juncture. So if you know you need like that 8.5 hours of sleep, some people need more sleep and some people need less. Some people are great with 5 to 6 hours. Other people need 9 to 10. And that's why the average, I think, is like 8 hours of sleep. But we need to know ourselves, right? So how much sleep do you really need to feel deeply rested? And then organize your life so that you can make that happen. If that means going to bed at 8:30 p.m. and getting up at 6 a.m., then do that, right?
Are there any Ayurveda tips as well? Because I know there's some people drink warm milk. I know there's different little things in Ayurveda that you can do before bedtime to help with your constitution, and obviously not to eat before a certain time.
Yeah. So if you go to bed with a full tummy, it will affect your body's ability to fall into a deep sleep and also to detoxify. So the recommendation is to stop eating at least 90 minutes, preferably 2 to 3 hours before bed. right? So if you go to bed at 9, that means you want to be done with the food by 7. And that gives you a good 2-hour window for the food to move from your stomach into your small intestine. So that initial stage of digestion is complete, and that's the one where there's like a lot going on that we would notice that might distract us and keep us from being comfortable and fall asleep. So that 2-hour window. And then there's a whole bunch of other things folks can do. Some people need to unplug hours before they go to bed. Some people are good to unplug 30 minutes before bed. I find I like to have a before bed routine. It helps me to settle so that I feel like I can turn myself over to the sleep process. So I make sure that the dog and the cat have fresh water, so nobody's going to wake me up in the middle of the night because they're thirsty. I make sure, I do things like finish up the dishes, turn on the dishwasher, check that the doors are locked, close blinds, all that kind of stuff. I'll also lay out my clothes for the next day, because anyone who knows me knows what I am not is a fashion person. I get so stressed out trying to figure out what to wear because I just don't know. And I've worn yoga pants for 24 years. Like, me and wear something else. So basically I have to like put my clothes out the night before so that my brain can rest. And if there's any I want to remember for tomorrow, where I'm like, oh, this is on my mind. I have to remember to answer that email. Then I keep a notepad by my bed and I just write those few points down. It's not an outline of the whole day. It's like, I got to remember this. I write it down, and then my mind has transferred it onto paper. So my mind doesn't have to hang on to it. My husband and I and then we do our, brush teeth, wash face, go to the bathroom, all that kind of stuff. And then we like puzzles. So we usually hop into bed and we do a puzzle together, or 2, or last night was 3. The word was very stressful, but that's okay. It's usually isn't. And then he'll sort of roll over and turn his light out. And I like to read before bed. I've learned that if I read something that is not exciting, like a murder mystery book. I've been reading a lot more Pema Chodron lately. I've sort of fallen back into wanting to reread all my children kind of stuff. So I'll read a chapter or a section of one of those texts, and it's enough to sort of have me in that space of like, oh yeah, thoughtful, mindful, but calm. And I find reading something that feels sort of peaceful and maybe heartwarming can also be nice, because then when I put that down and I close my eyes, then for me, I chant mantra before bed, because there's some really beautiful peace mantras that are recommended before sleep so that the mind is peaceful as we fall asleep for a more peaceful sleep. So I've been working with Om Mani Padme Hum for a while as I fall asleep. So I'll put my book down, turn my light off. I'll chant that a few times, maybe 2 or 3 times, and then I'll see about relaxing into sleep. So there's I've worked on it during the pandemic with how stressful things were. My sleep went to garbage. Like I was lucky if I got 3 hours a night for weeks on end as my yoga studio was collapsing, and like all these different things were happening. And so I doubled down, right? I doubled down on what I knew, which is, okay, now I don't have the freedom right now to be as blasé about my evening routine. And so I sort of shorted up a little bit. And yeah. And the other thing is, I don't mind doing it because I feel like it works. So part of the process of Ayurveda is also trying things to see if it works. Because if you do it and you don't feel like it's working, now that's stress before bed, where you're like, oh yeah, the lady said I have to do the thing, so I'm doing the thing, but I don't think the thing works and I don't like the thing. Whereas if it works for you, then you're like, oh yeah, I don't mind, because I'm going to get a positive result from this action or activity, and it's the result I'm looking for. Happy to do it. So I'm happy to do my routine because I feel like it genuinely supports my well-being. And for me, if I don't get enough sleep, it is not good.
The same. And I was just saying before, like, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just saying murder mysteries for me is my I am an absolute murder mystery buff. Give me a murder mystery at bedtime. And like, even now, like, even if I'm just reading 2, 3, 5 pages or a chapter or 2 chapters max, I normally get, because my husband falls asleep in 5 minutes.
So does
And
mine.
I'm so, like, men just like rolls over, boom, snoring, it's done. And I'm wide awake. So I need my brain is a lot more active, where he literally is like a switch, but then he'll get up in the morning, like very early, and boom, he's like up, ready to go. And I'm like, babe. So it's interesting when your husband and wife, your partner, whoever, you have completely different kind of body types and personalities. And obviously it's trying to merge together so that you're both feeding your individual needs to benefit the body and the mind. Mona, where can people find you? I'm going to create a link below to your website. You do teacher trainings, you do courses, and you also have books and their availability, obviously, to download the Ayurveda grieving workbook. What do you have coming up this year that is interesting or new, or different courses and teachings?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I think the best starting place for people to find me is probably the website,
Okay.
monawarner.com. And my email is actually the same, mona@monawarner.com. So if anyone wants to email me, yeah, happy to get email. And then in terms of upcoming, I'm really excited about the review of or the revision of the Grief and Ayurveda workbook. I loved it when I put it out. I felt really strongly about that project. And then this year I was in class and I was like, I want to build that out. I can do better now. So I'm very excited about that, but we don't have a timeline on it. So I'm thinking probably around the summertime, the new revision will go out. And what my plan is for those who purchase it through my website, which gets you or puts you through to my Hey Marvelous site and you can download it. Anyone who purchases the current workbook through there, when I shift the upload, everyone who's bought it, I'm going to email them and be like, you can download your updated copy now.
Okay.
People have already invested in it. I'm not going to make them buy it again. It's a PDF, right? So once it's all done, it's easy enough. So I'll have folks redo that, which is exciting. And the other thing that I'm looking forward to this year, a lot of the programs I run sort of start in January and run till December. So we've got our Ayurvedic health counselor program is underway, advanced teacher training is underway. All those things are kind of rolling. But I've had a lot of...
Are they online, the teacher trainings, or are they where you live?
They're hybrid. And so some parts can be in person where people are interested in being in person. Although last year we had, for our 200-hour teacher training, we ran it hybrid. And we had 2 ladies from across the country sign up, and they weren't going to come once a month all the way to here. Like, it's just, way too far, way too expensive. So most of what I do has an online component with an option of in-person if people are nearby or want to, which I think is nice because sometimes we still do want to actually hug each other when we can and get that connection. Although I do think we can do some awesome connecting online, and I'm very grateful for technology in creating those opportunities for us. But I think the next thing I'm going to put on the docket is a women's health sort of seminar. So I'd like to do a series of teachings where I talk about Ayurveda, and then I talk about hormones, and then we talk about menstruation, and then we talk about the perimenopausal transition. Because there are a lot of folks who are experiencing a lot of symptoms of a lot of things. Part of it is either the menstrual cycle is off rhythm, and so it's creating more distress to the body, and therefore the body is more tired and more depleted, and we feel like we can't keep up. And the other place where I see it happen a lot is the menopausal and andropausal for those who have the male hormones and male anatomy, right? So andropause for them, and mostly I have a lot of male clients, but it's again predominantly female. Yeah. Because often I work with whole families as well. So Mom
Yeah.
will come and then we'll be like, you need to talk to my husband. So then hubby will come, and then the kids one at a time as they hit puberty, or if they have any sort of issues, skin conditions, digestive issues as younger kids, then the kids come through as well. And so I'd like to re-offer my women's health seminars, because I think it offers a nice opportunity to have those conversations, but it's also filled with practical ideas of things we could try to support ourselves during these very important times. And they're all times of change, right? So how do we support ourselves during these times of fluctuation and change?
I feel like you would write an amazing either journal or workbook on perimenopause and menopause with the Ayurveda principles and the 3 pillars. Like, I don't think there's something like that out there. And I feel like we're in a generation where so many women now are going through perimenopause and menopause and just kind of like getting a lot of information of places like, social media. And it can be very confusing. What is right? What is not right? Everyone's body is different and everyone is experiencing it at different age. It would be amazing to have a journal or a workbook, just putting it out there.
I love ideas. Thank you.
I think it would be amazing. I'm definitely going to get your 3 pillars. I'm going to download the one on grief as well, because I'd like to just have that as a yoga teacher. For, I believe, the more that we learn about others, ourselves, and bodies and different modalities, even if you're just teaching yoga, it makes a huge difference. Because when we do a teacher training, we don't discuss things like grief. And grief comes up everywhere. And if you're teaching yoga, you're going to see grief come up in your students. And it can come up in something like a rash. As you said, there's like many different ways that grief shows up. And lots of people, I think their first initial reaction is just like, whoa, they don't know how to deal with it. So I think something like that is something that a handbook is something that yoga teachers should have on hand when they're teaching yoga. So I really applaud you for all the work that you do. I think you're an incredible, amazing person. Super, super knowledgeable about so much. And I love that the way that you're able to explain everything is very simple and very easy and very basic to understand, particularly for people who don't do yoga or don't know anything about Ayurveda or just beginning their health journey, and just the simple things that they can do every day, just being mindful of, getting up in the morning, going to bed, and everything in between, what they're putting into their body. So thank you so much. Is there anything that you would like to add? Any tips or anything that you have experienced or learned that you can share that would be valuable?
I'd say the biggest thing is that everyone knows themselves best. Everyone knows themselves best. And so even when I work with a client, I may be the person in the room who knows the most about Ayurveda or yoga or astrology, but they are the person in the room that knows the most about themselves. And so I think where we can learn to find the quiet, calm, steady inner voice that is plugged into all the knowing, like our entire inner database, that is why we yoga, that is why we Ayurveda, that is why we Vedic astrology, is so that we can connect to the part of ourself that has the answers, because no one else has our answers. We have our answers. And yes, sometimes we need the help of others to bring those forward, right? We are constantly mirrors for each other, and that can be beautiful and amazing. And I invite everyone to remember, you know yourself best, and don't let anyone tell you different. Look at me being bossy.
Thank you so much, Mona.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.